is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people. And for that, we congratulate you and the people of Guatemala for the support they have given.
Nixon praises Castillo Armas, the president of Guatemala, for overthrowing a communist regime.
In other words, the Arbenz regime was not a Guatemalan government. It was a foreign government controlled by foreigners.
Controlled by Moscow.
And that happened just here in the continent, right here in America, just here in America.
What Nixon doesn't say is that Castillo Armas was handpicked by the CIA. That his army was financed and trained by the CIA, and that Castillo Armas didn't lead a popular uprising against a communist regime, but was the head of a CIA-sponsored military coup. The man who devised the coup, the American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a zealous Cold Warrior. The mastermind of the coup is brother Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, a veteran of covert operations. The man who orchestrated the propaganda campaign, Agent E. Howard Hunt, who later became the notorious Watergate burglar. Their target? A man they called Red Jacobo. To the world, he is Jacobo Arbenz, the elected president of Guatemala. Arbenz makes a fatal political error. He takes land from an American company, gives it to peasants, and ignites the Cold War in Latin America.
I bring a song about bananas. I sing it low, I sing it high, yay, yay, and make it hit with Americanos. Sing a song about bananas.
They call it El Pulpo, the octopus. The United Fruit Company. United Fruit grows bananas and sells bananas.
Bananas can be eaten at any time and served at any meal.
It is called El Pulpo because it owns vast tracts of land all across Latin America. Its tentacles stretch into every presidential palace. And in this region, presidents are military dictators. Sam Zemere, the banana man, is at the helm of United Fruit. He got his start in the banana business by personally financing the overthrow of the president of Honduras in 1924. In Guatemala, United Fruit is the largest landowner. It owns the railway lines, it owns the power lines, and it controls the country's busiest ocean port.
Guatemala was a country where the previous military rulers had practically handed the country over to the United Fruit Company. They were in their pocket.
He was a dictator from an economic point of view. United Fruit had the final word about many, many things.
In the spring of 1951, United Fruit is suddenly confronted with an ominous threat. His name, Jacobo Arbenz. He is the newly elected president of Guatemala. Arbenz is swept to power on a promise to give land to peasants, to the Mayan Indians who farm the country's plantations. Arbenz is the son of a failed Swiss pharmacist, his mother a Guatemalan national of Spanish descent. He joins the army to get an education. Arbenz is magnetic, a born leader. He becomes one of the youngest captains to teach at the military academy. Angered by the brutality of Guatemala's military, Arbenz plots the overthrow of one of Latin America's most ruthless dictators, Jorge Ubico, the start of his country's revolution. Arbenz and his wife are sympathetic to the ideals of Marxism. They have both studied the Communist Manifesto, but Arbenz is not a party member.
Among his best friends were Jose Manuel Fortuny, and some of the other members of the then nascent Communist Party who were close to him, who had access to him.
Arbenz's first major act as president, Decree 900, a massive land reform bill. This propaganda film tells peasants if they want to have a family, they will need land. Arbenz expropriates land from coffee fincas owned by Guatemalan nationals and from the United Fruit Company, over 400,000 acres. The head of the Communist Party and author of Decree 900, Manuel Fortuny, tells Arbenz he may have acted too swiftly.
Él vio que yo no salté de alegría.
He saw that I wasn't jumping for joy.
Me dijo, parece que
And he said to me,
no te entusiasma mucho.
he said, it looks like you're not that excited about this expropriation. And I said to him, on the contrary, the expropriation had to happen,
Pero yo pensaba que
but I thought it would be done just before you left office,
cuando tú estuvieras
because now
tu gobierno.
we'll have a fight on two fronts,
Porque ahora
not only against the local landowners who have had land expropriated, but against the United Fruit Company as well.
expropiados, sino contra la United Fruit Company también.
Fortuny is proven right. Even though Arbenz expropriates only uncultivated land and pays a fair price for it, the United Fruit Company is furious. United Fruit is not only powerful in Guatemala, it has a good deal of leverage in Washington as well. Tom Corcoran is the fruit company's hired gun. On the Hill, he's Tommy the Cork, a Washington insider who can open any door. Cork tries to persuade those in power that a threat to its banana plantations is a threat to national security.
United Fruit did whatever it could to link the agrarian reform to a communist danger. And in the 1953, 1954, it had a pretty receptive audience.
Cork's audience is receptive for other reasons, too. John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan Dulles have both done legal work for United Fruit. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, John Moores Cabot, owns stock in United Fruit. His brother Thomas was president of the company in 1948. And the American ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge, also has money riding on United Fruit.
They were obviously defending the interests of a private corporation that had a dispute with a foreign government. It seemed to us unseemly to have the State Department every day echo the concerns of the United Fruit Company of Boston.
The United Fruit Company also enlists Edward Bernays, the grandfather of public relations. Bernays flies some of the most influential reporters, editors, and publishers in the United States to Guatemala. On these press junkets, company officials warn journalists of creeping communism in Latin America.
They gave them the story that the Marxists were coming in and trying to kick them out of the country. And this story became the front page headlines in the American press when the newsmen returned.
With the public, the opinion makers, and the politicians on their side, the Dulles brothers begin planning the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. For John Foster Dulles, Arbenz's removal becomes a personal crusade.
John Foster Dulles was a religious fanatic. He believed that you had to defeat communism. It was a struggle between good and evil. He felt that this was a fight to the death. He was ready for war.
With the public, the opinion makers, and the politicians on their side, the Dulles brothers begin planning the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. For John Foster Dulles, Arbenz's removal becomes a personal crusade.
John Foster Dulles was a religious fanatic. He believed that you had to defeat communism. It was a struggle between good and evil. He felt that this was a fight to the death. He was ready for war.
At CIA headquarters in the summer of 1953, Allen Dulles, the agency's director, recruits E. Howard Hunt as his propaganda chief in the plot to oust Arbenz.
And they took me into a small room in the agency and swore me a special oath. I must never tell what they were going to tell me.
Hunt can execute the covert operation, but Dulles needs a point man in the embassy, an ambassador who won't play by the rules. He appoints John Purifoy, another Cold Warrior. In his last posting, leftist guerrillas christened him the Butcher of Greece.
Purifoy era un gangster.
Purifoy was a gangster. Purifoy wasn't a diplomat, obviously. They sent Purifoy precisely for that reason, to prepare for a coup against Arbenz. He was basically a gunman. Well, he really went around with his gun here, under his jacket.
In Guatemala, Purifoy's embassy becomes the control center for the coup. The CIA takes over the top floor.
He owed the administration for his job and for his ambassadorial rank. So he was a very good boy. He went in a tamed individual, if you will, and did everything that we in CIA wanted.
Purifoy arrives in Guatemala City in October 1953. He invites the president and his wife to dinner.
He discussed in general terms, but in calm, conversational way, the dangers of letting communists take control of things.
Porque hubo un momento en que Purifoy le dijo lo siguiente a Arbenz.
There was a moment when Purifoy said the following to Arbenz.
Aquí el problema no es la United Fruit Company.
Mr. President, problem here isn't the United Fruit Company. We can make the United Fruit Company accept the expropriation as long as you kick out the communists and outlaw them.
The dinner lasts 6 hours. Arbenz is characteristically defiant. When Purifoy reports back to his boss in Washington, Arbenz's fate is sealed.
There had been some dispute within the administration and within the Department of State about is Arbenz a communist. And Purifoy pretty much put that to rest because he reported back to the Department of State. He said, I spent, I think 3-4 hours talking to President or Colonel Arbenz. And I have to say this, that I've subjected him to the duck test, and if you see a bird in a barnyard that waddles and quacks and swims like a duck, then the chances are it's a duck. As far as I'm concerned, Arbenz is a communist.
The Dulles brothers are now determined to remove Arbenz. Allen instructs Hunt to find a replacement, a man they can trust, a man the Indians will accept as one of their own. His name, Castillo Armas.
You could have taken off the army uniform, put him in Mayan costume, and had him climb one of the pyramids, and he would have looked very much at home there.
Armas is the ideal candidate. He had already tried to overthrow the Guatemalan government once before in 1950. After escaping from jail, he set up camp in Honduras. From here, he petitioned Arbenz's enemies for help.
His credentials were on his face. He was their man, and he was going to come in, he was going to get rid of the paleface.
The Americans' strongest ally inside Guatemala is the Catholic Church. The CIA contacts Cardinal Spellman in New York to take part in their psychological war against Arbenz. The Cardinal uses his authority to enlist the full cooperation of the head of the Guatemalan Church, Archbishop Arellano.
Cardinal Spellman convinced his counterpart in Guatemala to issue a pastoral letter several months before the coup, in which the cardinal basically spelled out his message to the flock that they should rise up against the communists in Guatemala and overthrow them. And then the CIA took that pastoral letter and airlifted it around Guatemala.
I didn't author the letter myself, but I think the propaganda shop turned it out. We had gotten the okay from Cardinal Spellman to go ahead with this, and I wouldn't presume to trace the lines of authority within the Catholic Church, how they get their information, but they do. And we've always said, you know, in an admiring way, that the Jesuits form the greatest intelligence service in the world, always have.
With the church on side, the CIA's next target, the Guatemalan military. The Dulles brothers know Arbenz's survival depends on the loyalty of his officers. The CIA plots to buy the cooperation of a select few.
When the day comes, and it's coming, stay in your barracks, that's all. We don't want you to lift an arm against anyone. Just stay there. We'll do the rest. And in fact, we were just saying, hey, stay in bed and you'll be well taken care of.
The pressure is mounting. Arbenz realizes he faces a far more dangerous enemy than his familiar rival, Castillo Armas. In the months leading up to the coup, Guatemala City is crawling with CIA spies. Anything that could bring down Arbenz. The city's bars are a cover for clandestine meetings. But it is Arbenz who snares the best informer. The personal courier of Castillo Armas sells him the plans for invasion. By the end of 1953, Arbenz has proof. The U.S. is plotting his overthrow. The threat is real. Arbenz must prepare for war. He decides to send Manuel Fortuny to Czechoslovakia to buy weapons. At the height of the Cold War, Arbenz is courting disaster.
Por supuesto que yo sabía cuál era el riesgo. Por eso es que mi viaje
I knew the risk.
¿Cómo se llama? Se ocultó.
That was why my trip was kept a secret. It was completely undercover.
Digamos.
After 2 months of negotiations, Fortuny secures a guarantee of arms. But Arbenz is not yet committed to war. He thinks he can force the Dulles brothers to call off their attack. He summons the press and reveals the secret plans for invasion.
It detailed almost point by point exactly what was going to happen in June of 1954 when the overthrow actually did occur. It had no impact at all. The CIA itself denounced this as a trick by the Guatemalan government to save its own skin. And eventually the whole aspect of this revelation vanished.
2 days after Arbenz's allegation, John Foster Dulles responds. He accuses Arbenz of being a tool of the Soviets, a pawn in the communist propaganda campaign. The media echoes his charge.
Caracas, Venezuela, scene of the Inter-American Conference being held for the
March 4th, 1954. Dulles chooses a meeting of the Organization of American States to isolate Arbenz, to cast his government as an outlaw.
O no nos hacíamos ninguna ilusión. Sabíamos perfectamente bien que en
We didn't have any illusions.
a Guatemala.
We knew perfectly well that in Caracas, Guatemala would be on trial.
Del gobierno de Arbenz mediante.
They would condemn Arbenz and his government by condemning the intervention of international communism in Latin America.
I believe that alien despotism is hostile to our ideals, and that if it does not heed our warning and keep away, we shall deal with it as a situation that might endanger the peace of America.
His argument was that here you have a situation where communism is rearing its ugly head, and you have to be with us, like it or not.
But there is no place here for political institutions which serve alien masters.
Only Guatemala votes against the U.S. resolution.
¿Qué hubiera pasado si, por ejemplo, algún país, cualquiera?
What would have happened, for example, if one country, any country, Venezuela, Colombia, were to have voted against the proposal of John Foster Dulles? Quite simply, the United States would have cut off their military aid, or any other type of aid that the United States gave to those countries.
Dulles has won tacit approval for Arbenz's overthrow. Now it is up to the CIA to defeat the enemy on his own turf, in Guatemala. From a shack just beyond the Guatemalan border, the CIA launches its radio war.
Los acusamos de alta traición.
La Voz de la Liberación invades Guatemala's airwaves. Its message is anti-communist, anti-Arbenz.
Acusamos a Jacobo Arbenz y su camarilla de traidores de haber vendido la patria a sus amos de la Unión Soviética.
Yo estaba de director jefe de la Radio Liberación.
I was the chief director of the Liberation Radio and Psychological Campaign. And we used a system of rhythmic prose and the proper musical background, which makes the message even more emotional.
Más emocionante, por decirlo así, recibir el mensaje.
The CIA spent only 35 days pre-recording the radio broadcasts in Opaloca, on the outskirts of Miami.
We could bring in people at night in what we call black flights, bring in the elements that were opposed to Arbenz. Dave Phillips was working for me as my propaganda coordinator, and he was in charge of coordinating the Guatemalan broadcasters and editorial writers. He made a propaganda workshop for himself using these Guatemalans who had gone into exile.
Both the CIA Dulles and the State Department Dulles felt that Guatemala was such a backward country and a small country and a primitive one that perhaps a psychological operation rather than a direct military intervention would be a more successful way of deposing Arbenz.
Arbenz's efforts to jam the broadcasts are futile. He resorts to blacking out all of Guatemala City. The radio's message is reinforced by a drop of anti-communist leaflets. Thousands fall from American planes on Guatemala City. Struggle for country, liberty, justice. Struggle against communist atheism, communist oppression, communist lies. In the same month that the CIA propaganda war starts, a CIA agent on the other side of the Atlantic spots a Czechoslovakian arms shipment in the Polish port of Stettin. A coded message goes out to Alan Dulles. My God, why have you forsaken me? Arbenz's secret mission is no longer secret. The CIA chief passes the information to his brother. John Foster Dulles goes straight to the press.
I was covering the State Department for the United Press at the time, and every day, Link White, the spokesman of the State Department, would give us a navigational report on where the Alphen was. And this, was to alert the Guatemalans that this boat was not unseen. And that the Czech arms really were the last drop in the bucket.
Dulles seizes the opportunity to proclaim Guatemala a communist threat.
By this arms shipment, a government in which communist influence is very strong has come into a position to dominate militarily the Central American area.
Dulles has one last thing to take care of before the coup can go ahead. He must keep a certain journalist out of Guatemala. New York Times reporter Sidney Grusin. Both Grusin and his wife Flora Lewis report on Latin America.
At one point, he had annoyed the Guatemalan government, and they had banned him and refused to give him another visa.
Grusin protested. The Times lobbied on his behalf. Guatemala allowed Grusin back in. Now he is under suspicion from the Americans.
That is what upset the CIA. After all, they were going to let him in, so that shows they really think he's on their side. So just utter nonsense.
Alan Dulles makes a call to the New York Times.
He told them that he was concerned about Sidney Grusin's reporting, that he felt Sidney Grusin, in fact, might even be a subversive.
Atención Guatemala, Radio Liberación, la emisora.
There's a huge invasion force poised on the border. The army had better get out, our men had better get out, everybody take cover.
Y decíamos que sí, que claro que sí. Eran nuestras...
And we say yes, of course, our columns are advancing. And there were 20 men, directed by Eduardo Tarazene de la Serna, who took Miramundo, and those were our columns.
Que tomó Miramundo, y así esas eran nuestras columnas.
The CIA's rebel army numbers less than 200. They are poorly armed, they lack transport, a shadow army. Just another weapon in the propaganda war.
Propaganda takes the place of armed combat, takes the place of bloodletting. You don't need to do it. If your enemy will surrender, if he's rendered incapable of independent action, then that's what you want.
Journalists arrive on the Honduran border. They are refused entry into Guatemala. A public relations firm, hired by United Fruit, hands out daily news bulletins, body counts from the front.
I knew they were all lies.
Evelyn Irons is reporting for the London Evening Standard. She finds the entire setup suspect.
You just have to knock 3 times and ask for Charlie, you know. It was very mysterious. And you got inside and there was a sort of conference room and a couple of 3 men there, and I didn't know who they were. And they just gave you these handouts from, you didn't know where they were from. And they said that in my first night, I heard them say, 200 killed today.
Irons wants proof. She wants to see the bodies. She hires a donkey and a guide to take her across the mountains to where Castillo Armas and his rebel army are camped. When Irons arrives in the rebel camp, her suspicions are confirmed.
They weren't taking any action at all. They were simply hanging about. I wanted to go and see about this famous battle in the night with the 200 dead soldiers lying about. But I got to look around, and I could only find 7 corpses scattered all over by the road and all the rest of it. And none of these peasants knew which side they were on.
The real battle is in Guatemala City. In the capital, the CIA wages a psychological war against Arbenz. American planes flown by CIA pilots strafe the city.
The airplanes really scared them to death. The diving planes firing their machine guns really cleared the streets in Guatemala City.
Yo estaba arreglando parte del tejado de mi casa
I was fixing the roof of my house, and I saw a plane, and after a while I heard some shooting. I didn't know exactly what it was, but the reality is, after a while, it was known that it was the first liberation plane. A plane, a T-47, we call it sulfato, you know, laxative, because all the people who were on the terrace of the palace shooting, they got sick to their stomachs.
And it was a sort of terror that these people had never experienced before.
For Arbenz, the planes signify something much more disastrous. He sees them as the prelude to an American invasion.
This was an incredible game of chicken, in a way. And there was no reason for Arbenz or anyone else to think that the government would blink. You're talking about Dwight D. Eisenhower. He led the largest amphibious invasion in military history. This guy is going to be deterred from landing a couple troops in Guatemala.
Arbenz needs the international community to step in and protect Guatemala from the United States. He appeals to the United Nations.
There was no other choice, no other way, nowhere else to turn. The only way was the United Nations. We only had that forum left to denounce what was happening in the country and the interference from the United States.
John Foster Dulles is determined Guatemala will be shunned by the United Nations. U.S. Representative Henry Cabot Lodge pressures the other Western powers to vote with him against Guatemala's request for international observers. In the end, only the Soviet Union supports Arbenz. Lodge uses the occasion to issue a stern warning to Moscow.
The Soviet Union has got designs on the American hemisphere. Stay out of this hemisphere, and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
It's a very sad thing that when a government appeals for help, and you know the international body that is supposed to provide succor turns a deaf ear.
He's a basket case. He's finished. He's tried everything that he can think of, and he's come up empty.
In Guatemala, La Voz de la Liberación aims its propaganda at the Guatemalan military, Arbenz's last hope for survival.
Nuestros servicios especiales de inteligencia infiltrados en todas las ramas del ejército. Actividades de los traidores a la patria, los estamos denunciando ante la opinión pública guatemalteca.
The military was no less immune to these types of psychological games that were being played than Arbenz was.
Arbenz never thought the army was going to turn its back on him. He never thought, never, that the army would do a 180-degree turn.
Worried about the loyalty of his officers, Arbenz sends an envoy to the front.
Arbenz asked him, "What do the military leaders say?" He said to him, "Excuse me, Mr. President, but I'm going to report to you the exact words of the military leaders. They said, 'You can go to hell.'"
I think the fact that losing the army support is what undoubtedly was the last straw. That really brought him down.
Arbenz remains closeted in his office all day. He is paralyzed by despair. The man whom the CIA had once described as brilliant, cultured, is a wreck.
He himself was weaker than people suspected. In fact, there was some suspicions that all this pressure was aggravating a kind of alcoholism which he had had bouts with before.
Arbenz's most trusted officer, a former student from the military academy, Colonel Diaz, meets with Ambassador Purifoy to see what can be done. William Krieg hears the colonel's question.
what can you do to call off Castillo Armas? And the ambassador said, I think that Arbenz would have to resign. I think he would have to go.
Diaz offers himself as a replacement for Arbenz. Purifoy agrees, and Diaz leaves to break the news to Arbenz.
Purifoy was most duplicitous with Diaz because he was not going to have Diaz take power. He was simply using Diaz as a first weapon to get rid of Arbenz.
Arbenz agrees to resign only if he can publicly hand over power to Diaz, and if Diaz promises to continue with his reforms.
Diaz se veía obligado a renunciar porque ya no contaba con el apoyo del ejército.
Arbenz felt obligated to resign because he no longer had the support of the army, and because he could leave a man in power who would safeguard the gains of the revolution.
We never were able to get inside Arbenz's mind, but what difference did it make, really? He left, and his motivations really between him and God and his wife.
June 27th, 9 p.m., Arbenz resigns, unbowed.
En nombre de que hacen esas barbaridades, ¿cuál es su bandera? Han tomado de pretexto al comunismo. La verdad hay que buscarla en los intereses financieros de la compañía frucera, temiendo que el ejemplo de Guatemala se propague a los hermanos países latinoamericanos.
Purifoy is incensed by Arbenz's accusations. The U.S. ambassador has no intention of allowing the revolution to continue. He pays a late-night visit to the new president of Guatemala.
Purifoy le dijo a Díaz, quiero que usted me demuestre.
Purifoy told Diaz, I want you to show me that you will have a government that will be satisfactory to the United States. And the proof of this is for you to execute 25 communists from a list that I will provide you with today.
At noon, Diaz informs Purifoy he is about to release all political prisoners, including communists. Purifoy is livid. His cable to the CIA control center in Opalaca is short and to the point. We have been double-crossed. Bomb. In the early hours of the morning, Purifoy visits Diaz again. This time to put their man, Castillo Armas, in power. Under Purifoy's watch, Diaz and his supporters are forced from office at gunpoint by military rivals. Arbenz's appointee lasts only 24 hours.
This is a revolution, boys, and you're out. Not just Arbenz, but you're out also.
July 3rd, 1954, Castillo Armas returns to Guatemala City aboard a U.S. Embassy plane. He receives a hero's welcome, choreographed by the CIA. The press reports on a victorious popular uprising against communism.
100,000 persons swarm under the palace balcony to pour out their acclaim for the rough and ready colonel, Guatemala's fighting anti-communist crusader.
You thought that your own government wasn't going to tell you the truth, but wasn't going to tell you a flat lie. But that turned out to be wrong.
So forth and so on. I said, but how is your government coming? He said, it's going to the dogs. He said, they took everyone who knew how to read and write. They meaning the Arbenz group, everybody who knew how to run a government, is what he was telling me, was in exile, had left. Y yo me quedé con la mierda, and I stayed with shit. Like many of the people who collaborate with the United States for a while and see that maybe it's not in the best interests of the country, end up with second thoughts and with real guilt feelings.
3 years after assuming power, Castillo Armas was assassinated by a military rival. As for Jacobo Arbenz, his political career died with the coup. He never returned to Guatemala. He spent most of the remainder of his life in Cuba and his final years in Mexico, where he drowned mysteriously in a bathtub in 1971. Ambassador Purifoy, the State Department's cold warrior, was posted to Thailand. He died along with his son in a car crash just 1 year after the coup. Although there was speculation that he was killed by leftist guerrillas, murder was never proven.
Bananas are a favorite at breakfast.
United Fruit was the biggest benefactor of Arbenz's demise. Expropriated land was returned. The company once again had the ear of the president of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company eventually was consumed by a series of corporate takeovers and mergers. The company's new name is Chiquita Banana.
John Foster Dulles died in 1959, 2 years before John Kennedy took power. His brother Alan was forced to resign in 1961 after persuading Kennedy that getting rid of a communist threat in Cuba, namely Fidel Castro, would be just as easy as the overthrow of Arbenz. Success in Guatemala had bloated the confidence of the CIA.
It reinforced what one might almost call the legend of invincibility, that, God, what we can do, we can outsmart everyone.
In April 1961, the CIA, with Kennedy's blessing, launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. But Castro was not easily unnerved. He vowed never to step down, never to leave like Arbenz had in the middle of the night. Castro's conviction was bolstered by a young revolutionary who had seen Arbenz's defeat up close, Che Guevara. Cuba was a humiliating fiasco for the CIA. The easy success of the Guatemalan operation was never to be repeated. Agent E. Howard Hunt, who had directed the Bay of Pigs, saw it was time to move on.
The seeds of destruction were in the success of the Guatemalan coup. That was really the beginning of the end of the CIA covert operations.
Less than a decade later, Hunt was imprisoned for breaking into Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel under orders from Richard Nixon. As for the Guatemalans, after the coup, their country was ruled by fear. The Guatemalan people suffered for decades under a succession of ruthless military dictators. More than 100,000 people were killed.
The legacy of Guatemala is sheer horror, and it's something that the U.S. cannot be forgiven for.
The regime that was established essentially by the United States was monstrous, really savage.
In 1995, Arbenz's wife and son lead the procession to his final resting place. Arbenz had finally been permitted to return to Guatemala.